You honestly think I'm going to tell her? The voice crackled through the phone speaker, undeniably Ludmila's. Soledad is sweet, but she's clueless. Pierluigi has been looking for an out for months. Soledad froze, her thumb hovering over the end call button. Ludmila had forgotten to hang up. She thinks he's staying late for project meetings, Ludmila scoffed, a dry, sharp sound. He's not. He's with me, and honestly, I think I'm doing her a favor. She deserves someone less complicated. The breath rushed out of Soledad's lungs, the world tilting sharply on its axis. Everything she knew was a lie. The silence in Soledad Lima's apartment was usually a comfort, a haven of soft cream textiles and the faint smell of eucalyptus, a sharp contrast to the bustling architectural firm where she and Pierluigi worked. Today, however, the silence was suffocating, thick with the echoing betrayal that had just tumbled from the small black rectangle resting innocently on her kitchen counter. She stared at the phone. The screen had finally gone dark, the call disconnected, but Ludmila's words hung in the air like toxic smoke. He's with me. Ludmila Ostrovsky, her best friend since university, the woman she had shared late-night study sessions with, the one she'd consoled through countless breakups, the one who had introduced her to Pierluigi 3 years ago. Soledad sank onto one of the minimalist bar stools, her legs suddenly refusing to support her weight. Pierluigi Auger, charming, ambitious, with eyes the color of strong espresso that always seemed to seek hers out across a crowded room. They had been planning a trip to Tuscany in the spring, or at least she had been planning it. Pierluigi had been increasingly swamped, his evenings stretching into the early hours, leaving her alone with travel brochures and a growing sense of unease she had until now furiously ignored. Clueless. That was the word Ludmila had used. The sting was almost worse than the infidelity itself, the condescension, the utter lack of guilt. She didn't just feel betrayed, she felt foolish. A caricature of the trusting girlfriend, blindly making dinner reservations while her partner and her best friend dismantled her life behind her back. She reached for the phone again, her hand trembling so violently she almost dropped it. She needed to call him. She needed to scream, to demand answers, to tear the carefully constructed facade of their relationship to shreds. But as she unlocked the screen, a chilling realization washed over her. If she confronted them now, she would be the emotional, irrational girlfriend. They would likely deny it, spin it, make her feel crazy. Ludmila was a master manipulator, and Pierluigi was an expert at avoidance. No, confrontation wasn't the answer, not yet. Soledad drew a shuddering breath, forcing her racing heart to steady. The initial shock was receding, leaving behind a cold, hard knot of determination in her stomach. They thought she was clueless. They thought she was weak. They were about to discover exactly what kind of woman Soledad Lima truly was. She stood up, the movement slow and deliberate. She walked into the bathroom and stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her dark hair was messy, her brown eyes wide and frightened. She didn't look like a woman plotting revenge. She looked like a victim. She turned on the cold water tap and splashed her face, the icy shock grounding her. She grabbed a towel and patted her skin dry, her gaze hardening as she looked back at herself. The frightened girl was gone. In her place was someone else, someone forged in the sudden, violent heat of betrayal. She walked back into the living room and picked up her laptop. If Pierluigi was with Ludmila, he wasn't at the office. She opened her email and quickly typed out a message to Gerd Decker, the senior partner at their firm. Gerd was a tough, uncompromising man, known for his low tolerance for drama and his high expectations. Gerd, she wrote, I need to take a few personal days, family emergency. I'll make sure all my current projects are covered before I leave. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. She needed time. Time to think, time to plan, time to figure out exactly how to tear their lives apart, piece by meticulously placed piece. The sound of a key turning in the lock sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her veins. Pierluigi, he was home early. Soledad slammed the laptop shut and quickly crossed the room, grabbing a throw pillow from the sofa and feigning an interest in a stray thread. Hey, babe, Pierluigi called out, his voice smooth and familiar, the sound grating against her raw nerves. I managed to get out early. The meeting ended sooner than expected. He walked into the living room, loosening his tie, his handsome face betraying nothing but exhaustion. He smiled at her, that same devastating smile that had won her over 3 years ago. That's great, Soledad managed to say, her voice remarkably steady. She forced a small, tight smile onto her lips. I was just thinking about making some dinner. Sounds perfect, he said, moving towards her. He leaned in and pressed a kiss to her cheek. It felt like a brand. I'm starving. Soledad closed her eyes. The scent of his cologne, mixed with a faint, unmistakable floral note that she now recognized as Ludmila's expensive perfume, making her stomach churn. I'll just go change, she said, pulling away smoothly, feigning casualness. As she walked into the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her, she leaned against the wood, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The game had begun, and Soledad fully intended to win. The next 3 days were a masterclass in compartmentalization. To Pierluigi, Soledad remained the supportive, slightly distracted girlfriend dealing with a vague family issue. To the outside world, she was absent, her phone mostly turned off. In reality, her apartment had become a war room. She spent hours sifting through bank statements, phone records, and emails. Pierluigi was careless. He relied on Soledad's trust, leaving his tablet unlocked, his email password saved on their shared desktop. The digital breadcrumbs were substantial. There were the expensive dinners at restaurants he claimed were for client meetings, restaurants where she later found social media posts from Ludmila, vaguely bragging about amazing culinary experiences. There were the weekend conferences in cities that suspiciously aligned with Ludmila's sudden trips to visit old friends. But the most damning evidence wasn't financial, it was professional. Pierluigi was leading the design team for the massive Horizon project, a sustainable housing development that was supposed to put their firm on the map. It was his baby, his ticket to a junior partnership. Soledad, though a talented architect in her own right, had taken a step back, supporting him, offering feedback, smoothing over tensions with difficult contractors. As she dug deeper into his files, a sickening pattern emerged. Whole sections of the conceptual design, the innovative rainwater harvesting systems, the passive cooling structures, were identical to sketches Soledad had casually shared with him months ago, ideas she had been developing for her own portfolio. He hadn't just stolen her heart, he was stealing her intellectual property. The realization was a cold plunge into an icy lake. The betrayal transcended the personal. It struck at the core of her professional identity. This wasn't just a messy breakup waiting to happen. This was a calculated exploitation. On Wednesday afternoon, the silence of her apartment was broken by a frantic knock. Soledad checked the peephole. It was René Luna, a junior architect at the firm, and one of the few people Soledad considered a genuine friend outside of the poisoned circle of Ludmila and Pierluigi. Soledad unlocked the door, and René practically tumbled in, his normally neat hair disheveled. "Sol, thank God!" René gasped, clutching a thick roll of blueprints. "I've been trying to call you. Gerd is on the warpath." "What happened?" Soledad asked, leading him into the kitchen and pouring him a glass of water. René took a long gulp before answering. "The Horizon project presentation is tomorrow morning. Pierluigi is losing it. The structural integrity report on the passive cooling towers just came back, and it's a disaster. They're unstable." Soledad frowned. "That doesn't make sense. I ran the simulations on those towers myself. They were solid." "Did you run them on the current design?" René asked, unrolling the blueprints across the counter. Soledad leaned over the paper, her eyes scanning the complex lines and calculations. Her stomach dropped. Pierluigi had changed the design. He had altered the curvature of the towers, prioritizing a sleeker aesthetic over structural soundness. It was a rookie mistake, a sacrifice of function for form that she would never have approved. "He changed the load-bearing parameters," she whispered, her finger tracing the fatal flaw. "This entire section will collapse under high winds." "Exactly," René said, running a hand through his hair. "And he's trying to blame it on the engineering team, but the engineers are pushing back. Gerd is demanding a complete review before the presentation to the clients tomorrow. If they don't have a solution, the firm loses the contract." Soledad stared at the blueprints, a dangerous idea beginning to form. Pierluigi was cornered. He had stolen her designs, butchered them for vanity, and was now facing professional ruin. "Where is he now?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "At the office, yelling at anyone who will listen," René sighed. "He tried to call you, said you were the only one who could translate the engineering jargon for him. When he couldn't reach you, he left." Left? Yeah, muttered something about needing a clear head. Said he had an emergency meeting with a consultant. Soledad didn't need to guess who the consultant was. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Even now, on the brink of disaster, he was running to Ludmila. "René," Soledad said, turning to face him, her eyes burning with a fierce intensity. "I need a favor, a massive favor." René blinked, taken aback by the sudden change in her demeanor. "Anything, Sol. You know that. I need you to get me into the firm's central server tonight, specifically the secure files for the Horizon project." René's eyes widened. "Sol, that's restricted access. Only senior partners and the lead architect have—" He stopped, realization dawning. "You want to fix it?" "No," Soledad said, a slow, cold smile spreading across her face. "I want to make sure everyone knows exactly who broke it." The firm was eerily quiet at 11 p.m. The sleek glass-walled offices, usually buzzing with frantic energy, were dark, save for the emergency lights casting long, distorted shadows across the polished concrete floors. René, sweating profusely despite the cool air conditioning, swiped his security card at the server room door. It flashed green with a soft chirp. He pushed the heavy door open, revealing rows of blinking servers humming like a captive swarm of bees. "You have 10 minutes, René whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "The night guard does his rounds at 1:15. "That's all I need," Soledad replied, slipping past him into the dimly lit room. She connected her laptop to the main terminal. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the standard security protocols using back doors she had quietly discovered months ago during a late-night debugging session. She wasn't an IT expert, but she knew the architecture of the firm's network intimately. She located the Horizon Project folder. Inside was Pierluigi's final presentation, slated for 9 a.m. the next day. It was slick, polished, and completely devoid of the structural warnings René had mentioned. Pierluigi was planning to bluff his way through, hoping to win the contract on the aesthetics alone and deal with the engineering hiccups later. It was a gamble that could cost the firm millions and potentially endanger lives. Soledad opened the master presentation file. She didn't delete anything. That would be too obvious, too easily written off as a technical glitch. Instead, she added. She inserted the original simulations she had run, the ones proving her initial design was sound. Then, she juxtaposed them with Pierluigi's altered, flawed designs, highlighting the critical points of failure with glaring red graphics. But she didn't stop there. She accessed Pierluigi's firm email, searching for a specific thread she had found on his home tablet. A series of emails between him and Ludmila, discussing the project. Ludmila wasn't an architect. She was in marketing for a rival firm. "Just make the towers look like the Bilbao Museum, Pier. The clients don't care about the math, they care about the wow factor. I can spin the PR if there are minor issues later," Ludmila had written. "You're right. The engineers are just being overly cautious. I'll tweak the specs. See you tonight at our spot," Pierluigi had replied. Soledad took screenshots of the exchange, ensuring the dates, times, and email addresses were clearly visible. She created a hidden slide at the very end of the presentation, embedding the screenshots alongside a side-by-side comparison of her original sketches and Pierluigi's stolen finalized renderings. She titled the final slide, "The True Cost of Design, a case study in stolen intellectual property and structural negligence." It was a professional death sentence. 2 minutes, Sol! René hissed from the doorway, his anxiety radiating across the room. "Done," Soledad said, saving the file and swiftly disconnecting her laptop. She erased the access logs, covering her tracks with meticulous care. They slipped out of the server room just as the heavy footsteps of the night guard echoed from the stairwell. They ducked into a nearby supply closet, holding their breath until the beam of the guard's flashlight swept past the frosted glass and faded down the hall. Once they were safely out of the building and standing in the cool night air, René turned to her, his face pale under the streetlights. "What did you do?" he asked, a mixture of awe and fear in his voice. "I leveled the playing field," Soledad said simply. She looked up at the towering glass facade of the firm, a sense of profound calm washing over her. The anger was still there, but it was no longer a frantic, burning thing. It was a focused, icy resolve. "Tomorrow's going to be messy," René muttered, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Yes," Soledad agreed, pulling her coat tighter around her. "It is." She didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window of her apartment, watching the city below slowly wake up. She imagined Pierluigi beside her, oblivious to the storm about to break over his head. She imagined Ludmila, smug in her stolen victory. By 8 a.m., she was dressed in a sharp slate-gray suit, her hair pulled back severely, her makeup flawless. She looked like a woman going to battle. When she walked into the firm, the atmosphere was electric. The Horizon Project presentation was the event of the year. The large glass conference room was already filling up with the clients, a consortium of wealthy developers, and the firm's senior partners, including the formidable Gerd Decker. Soledad didn't go to the conference room. She went to her desk, poured a cup of coffee, and waited. At exactly 9:05 a.m., the presentation began. She couldn't hear the words, but through the glass walls she could see Pierluigi standing confidently at the head of the table, his charming smile firmly in place. He clicked to the first slide. The silence that followed was palpable, even through the soundproof glass. Soledad took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes locked on the conference room. The dominoes had started to fall. Through the transparent partition, she watched Pierluigi's devastating smile curdle into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He had clicked the remote, expecting the sleek minimalist rendering of the Horizon Project's exterior. Instead, the massive 8K screen behind him flared with the glaring red graphics Soledad had meticulously inserted. The title of the slide flashed like a warning beacon. Critical structural failure. Load-bearing collapse parameters. Pierluigi frantically clicked the remote again, his thumb mashing the button, desperate to advance the slide. But the presentation didn't move forward. It moved to the hidden slide. The screen split in two. On the left, Soledad's original time-stamped blueprints with complex structural algorithms. On the right, Pierluigi's altered, aesthetically pleasing but fatally flawed version. And beneath it all, the damning email screenshots between him and Ludmila. Just make the towers look like the Bilbao Museum, Pier. I can spin the PR if there are minor issues later. Soledad took another slow sip of her coffee. It was lukewarm, but it tasted like absolute victory. Inside the room, chaos erupted. Bertel McCormick, the lead investor for the consortium, a notoriously ruthless billionaire developer, stood up, his face a mottled, furious red. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger at the screen, then at Pierluigi. Gerd Decker, the senior partner, looked as though he might have a stroke. His usually impassive face was contorted in a snarl as he slammed his hands flat onto the polished mahogany table. He barked something at Pierluigi, the veins in his neck bulging. Pierluigi, pale and sweating, held his hands up in a placating gesture. He was talking fast, shaking his head, his eyes darting frantically around the room. Then, as if sensing the crosshairs resting squarely on his back, his gaze snapped through the glass walls and locked onto Soledad sitting calmly at her desk. Even through the soundproof glass, she could see the exact moment his panic morphed into vicious, desperate malice. He pointed directly at her. It was time. Soledad stood, smoothing the imaginary wrinkles from her slate-gray skirt. She picked up a thick leather-bound portfolio from her desk and walked toward the conference room. The entire open-plan office had gone dead silent, every architect, intern, and assistant staring at the unfolding catastrophe. She pushed the heavy glass door open. The sound hit her like a physical blow. "A disgruntled, unstable girlfriend!" Pierluigi was shouting, his voice shrill, a stark contrast to his usual smooth baritone. "She hacked my terminal. This is a fabrication, Gerd, a malicious attack by a jealous woman because I tried to end things last night." "Is that so?" Soledad's voice was remarkably calm, cutting through the shouting like a finely honed blade. Every head in the room swiveled toward her. Pierluigi stumbled back a step, genuinely shocked that she had entered the lion's den. "Soledad," Gerd growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "What is the meaning of this? Is this your doing? The presentation alterations?" "Yes," Soledad said, walking smoothly to the head of the table. She didn't look at Pierluigi. She looked directly at Gerd and then at Bertel McCormick. The original structural mathematics, the ones that actually keep those towers from collapsing and killing hundreds of people, those are also mine. Pierluigi stole them, altered them to fit a marketing directive from his mistress, and planned to lie to you all this morning." "You lying bitch," Pierluigi hissed, stepping toward her. "Mister, Augur, if you take one more step toward her, I will personally throw you through that window, a new voice drawled. Soledad blinked, pulling her gaze away from Pierluigi. Sitting next to Bertil McCormick was a man she hadn't noticed before. He was tall, dressed in a sharply tailored navy suit, with striking silver-flecked dark hair and piercing, intelligent gray eyes. Philippe Duhamel, Gerd introduced him briskly, rubbing his temples. The independent structural engineering consultant Mr. McCormick insisted on bringing in to vet the project. Philippe leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Soledad with intense, unreadable curiosity. I ran my own preliminary simulations last night on the files Mr. Augur sent us, Philippe said, his French accent lending a quiet authority to his words. They matched the flawed data currently displayed on the right side of that screen. They were, in a word, disastrous. I came here today to kill this project. He paused, gesturing gracefully toward the screen. However, the equations on the left, the ones you claim are yours, Miss Lima, are flawlessly balanced. Brilliant, actually. Pierluigi's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. I have the original physical drafts, time-stamped and notarized in my personal logbooks, Soledad said, dropping the heavy leather portfolio onto the table with a resounding thud. You can verify every line. Bertil McCormick let out a sudden booming laugh that startled everyone. Well, I'll be damned. The boy's a fraud, Gerd. You put a fraud in charge of my $200 million development. Pierluigi, Gerd said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. Get out. Security will box your desk. We will be pursuing legal action. Gerd, you can't. Now, Gerd roared. Pierluigi cast one last look at Soledad, a look of pure, unadulterated venom, before turning and fleeing the room. The silence he left behind was heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and shattered careers. Gerd slowly sank back into his chair, looking 10 years older. He looked at Soledad. My office, 5 minutes. Gerd's corner office was a testament to his intimidating persona, dark wood, leather, and abstract steel sculptures. Soledad sat perfectly straight in the guest chair, refusing to show the nervous tremor in her hands. Beside her sat Philippe Duhamel, who had insisted on joining the meeting at Bertil McCormick's behest. You turned my firm into a public circus, Soledad, Gerd stated, pouring himself a 2-finger measure of scotch despite it only being 10 in the morning. He didn't offer them any. I saved your firm from a catastrophic lawsuit and massive loss of life, Soledad countered evenly, meeting his furious gaze. Pierluigi was going to let you break ground on a death trap. You should have come to me privately. Would you have believed me? She asked softly. Over your golden boy? Over the man you were grooming for a junior partnership? Without the absolute, undeniable spectacle of public proof, Pierluigi would have charmed his way out of it, and you know it. Gerd clenched his jaw, staring out the window at the city skyline. He took a slow sip of his scotch. Perhaps. Miss Lima is correct, Philippe interjected smoothly, crossing one long leg over the other. McCormick was ready to pull funding entirely. The only reason he hasn't is because he wants her. Soledad turned to Philippe, startled. He wants me? Bertil is a shark, Philippe said, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. He appreciates a predator who knows how to sink her teeth in. He was highly impressed by your presentation. He told Gerd that the consortium will only keep their money in the Horizon project on one condition. You are to be the lead architect, Gerd sighed, sounding entirely defeated. Effective immediately. You will take over Pierluigi's office, you will fix this mess, and you will work directly with Mr. Duhamel here to ensure the engineering is ironclad. Soledad's breath hitched. Lead architect. The promotion she had worked so hard for, the one she had sacrificed her own ambition to help Pierluigi achieve. It was finally hers. I accept, she said, her voice unwavering. Don't celebrate yet, Gerd warned darkly. Pierluigi isn't going to go quietly, and his associate, Ludmila Ostrovsky, works for Vanguard PR. They represent Suzanne Nascimento, our biggest rival in the sustainable sector. This is going to get very ugly, very quickly. Gerd's warning proved prophetic before lunchtime. Soledad was in the process of moving her things into Pierluigi's vacated corner office when her phone buzzed. It was a Google alert for her name. She opened the link. It was an exclusive article published by Architectural Digest's online blog, a highly trafficked industry site. The headline made her stomach drop. Scorned Lover Sabotages Rising Star, the Horizon Project Hack. The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. It cited anonymous sources, undoubtedly Ludmila, claiming Soledad was severely mentally unstable, prone to jealous rages, and had fabricated the structural flaws to ruin Pierluigi after a messy breakup. It painted Pierluigi as a brilliant visionary tragically targeted by a vindictive ex. Worse, it questioned the firm's security protocols and Gerd Decker's leadership for allowing domestic disputes to threaten multi-million-dollar investments. "They're spinning the narrative," a deep voice said from the doorway. Soledad looked up to see Philippe leaning against the doorframe, his gray eyes assessing her pale face. "Ludmila," Soledad whispered, dropping the phone onto the desk. "She's a master manipulator. By tomorrow, the entire industry will think I'm a hysterical, jealous hacker." Philippe walked into the office and picked up her phone, his eyes scanning the article. His jaw tightened. It is a desperate move. But PR is a powerful weapon. If the investors get spooked by the bad press, even Bertel might not be able to keep them on board. He set the phone down and looked directly at her. There was no pity in his eyes, only a sharp, challenging intelligence. "So, Soledad Lima, you blew up the bridge. How do you plan to cross the river?" Soledad closed her eyes for a brief second, drawing a deep breath. She thought of the frightened girl in the mirror 3 days ago. That girl was dead. "We fight back," Soledad said, her eyes snapping open, blazing with renewed fury. "They want a war of reputation? Fine, but I'm not fighting on their terms. I'm going to bury them in undeniable facts." The next 72 hours were a blur of caffeine, complex mathematics, and legal warfare. The firm's atmosphere was tense, a siege mentality taking hold. Gerd had brought in Margaret Jackson, the firm's formidable external legal counsel. Maigret was a terrifying woman in her 60s, with a razor-sharp bob and a complete lack of empathy. She paced Soledad's new office, rattling off cease and desist orders and defamation lawsuit strategies against Vanguard PR and the architectural blog. "We need more than just he said, she said on the IP theft, Soledad," Maigret stated, tapping a manicured nail against the glass desk. "The hidden slide was good theater, but a decent defense attorney will argue you manipulated those files post-breakup. We need concrete financial proof of malicious intent. We need a motive beyond just vanity." Soledad rubbed her burning eyes. "I don't know what else to give you. I showed you the design timelines." "Not enough," Maigret clipped. "Keep digging." As Maigret swept out of the room, René slipped in, locking the door behind him. He looked exhausted, clutching a massive stack of manila folders. "I think I found the motive," René whispered, dumping the folders onto her desk. Philippe, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner reviewing load-bearing stresses, looked up, intrigued. Over the past 3 days, Philippe had become a constant presence. They had worked late into the night, redesigning the cooling towers. He was brilliant, demanding, and unexpectedly gentle when the exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. He treated her like an equal, a stark contrast to Pierluigi's patronizing pats on the head. "What is all this?" Soledad asked, pulling a folder toward her. "I took a deep dive into the firm's vendor payout accounts," René explained, his voice hushed, "specifically the independent contractors Pierluigi approved for the Horizon conceptual phase." Soledad opened the folder. It contained invoices for a company called Ostrovsky and Auger Design Solutions. The payments were massive, tens of thousands of dollars billed for consulting fees and material sourcing. "Ostrovsky and Auger," Philippe murmured, coming to stand behind Soledad's chair, his presence a warm, solid comfort at her back. "They incorporated." "They didn't just steal your designs, Sol," René said, looking sick. "They've been siphoning firm funds to seed their own boutique agency. And look at the date of incorporation." Soledad checked the document. 8 months ago, right around the time Pierluigi had started pulling away, acting stressed, staying out late. "And there's one more thing," René added, sliding a printed email to the top of the pile. "I found this in the firm's deleted server cache. Pierluigi sent a portfolio to a private server address last week." Soledad read the email. It was addressed to Suzanne Nascimento, the rival developer Gerd had warned them about. The body of the email read, "Suzanne, attached is the portfolio for O&A design. As discussed, we are ready to bring the Horizon aesthetic to your new waterfront development. Funding is secure." The breath rushed out of Soledad's lungs. The betrayal was so deep, so multi-layered, it was almost hard to comprehend. Pierluigi wasn't just leaving her for Ludmila. They were using her stolen designs and the firm's own stolen money to jump ship to a rival company. Corporate espionage, embezzlement, and intellectual property theft, Philippe summarized softly, his hand lightly resting on the back of Soledad's chair. Maigret is going to have a field day. Soledad stared at the documents, the cold knot in her stomach solidifying into something entirely indestructible. Ludmila thought she was so clever, spinning stories in the press, but she had left a paper trail a mile long. "Renee," Soledad said, her voice ringing with a terrifying clarity, "get Maigret back in here, right now." As Renee scrambled out of the office, Soledad turned to look at Philippe. The intensity in his gray eyes made her heart skip a beat, a sudden sharp flutter that had nothing to do with anger or betrayal. "You are quite magnificent when you are plotting to destroy your enemies," Philippe observed quietly, the corner of his mouth turning up in a devastatingly attractive smirk. "They thought I was just the clueless girlfriend," Soledad said, holding his gaze. "They were entirely, catastrophically wrong," Philippe agreed softly. Soledad looked back at the damning evidence on her desk. The smear campaign in the press didn't matter anymore. Pierluigi and Ludmila were playing a game of checkers, relying on gossip and PR. Soledad was playing chess, and she was about to put them in checkmate. The conference room on the 42nd floor was a sterile, glass-enclosed theater designed for intimidation. It was Thursday morning, exactly 1 week since Soledad had first overheard Ludmila's treacherous phone call. Today, it would serve as an execution chamber. Soledad sat perfectly still at the center of the long mahogany table, her slate-gray suit acting as armor. Flanking her were Maigret Jackson, the firm's terrifying external counsel, and Philippe Duhamel, whose quiet, imposing presence felt like an impenetrable wall at her back. Across the table sat Pierluigi, looking uncharacteristically haggard despite his bespoke suit, and Ludmila, who was attempting to maintain an air of haughty victimization. Beside them was Slawomir Geringer, a notoriously aggressive defense attorney whose slicked-back hair and expensive cologne preceded him into the room. At the far end of the table, looking profoundly uncomfortable, sat Campbell Hruba, the editor-in-chief of the Architectural Digest blog that had published the hit piece on Soledad. Campbell had been legally compelled to attend by Maigret under the threat of a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit that could bankrupt his publication. And finally, patched in via a massive flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall, was Suzanne Nascimento, the rival developer. She looked sharp and impatient, a silver-haired titan of industry who did not like having her morning interrupted. "Let's make this brief, Maigret," Slawomir Geringer began, steepling his fingers. "My clients have suffered immense reputational damage. The accusation of intellectual property theft is baseless, and we are prepared to file a countersuit for wrongful termination and slander. However, Mr. Auger is willing to walk away quietly for a severance package of $5 million and a public retraction of the theatrics Miss Lima orchestrated." Ludmila nodded, dabbing at a completely dry eye with a tissue. "We just want to move on from this toxic environment." Soledad didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She let the silence stretch until it became suffocating. Maigret smiled. It was a terrifying expression. "Mr. Geringer, did your clients happen to mention a company called Ostrovsky and Auger Design Solutions?" Slawomir's brow furrowed almost imperceptibly. He shot a quick, sharp glance at Pierluigi, whose pale complexion suddenly turned a sickly shade of gray. "I am not aware of—" "I didn't think so," Maigret interrupted smoothly. She slid a thick-bound dossier across the polished table. It stopped precisely in front of Slawomir. "Open it." The room held its collective breath as the attorney flipped open the folder. "What you are looking at," Soledad spoke for the first time, her voice a calm, chilling bell ringing in the quiet room, "are the incorporation papers for O&A Design, filed 8 months ago. Behind them are the vendor payout logs from this firm, authorizing over $400,000 in consulting and material sourcing fees to O&A Design. Fees authorized by Pierluigi Auger, paid to a company co-owned by Ludmila Ostrovsky." Ludmila's jaw dropped. She turned to Pierluigi, her eyes wide with sudden unmasked panic. "Pier, you said you wiped the vendor cache. He missed the redundant server backups." René Luna's voice crackled from a small speaker on the table. He was monitoring the meeting from the IT bay. Rookie mistake. Slawomir Geringer was flipping through the pages rapidly, his professional composure disintegrating with every turned sheet. Pierluigi, what is this? It's wire fraud, Mr. Geringer, Philippe interjected, his heavy French accent wrapping around the legal terms with lethal precision. Embezzlement, corporate espionage. Wait, there's more, Soledad said, turning her gaze to the monitor where Susanna Nascimento was watching with narrowed, furious eyes. Ms. Nascimento, turn to page 42. Maigret had messengered a duplicate file to the rival developer an hour prior. On the screen, Suzanne flipped open her folder. That is an email sent from Pierluigi to your private server last week, Soledad explained, her tone devoid of any emotion. Offering you the Stolen Horizon project designs under the banner of his and Ludmila's newly funded boutique agency, an agency funded by stolen money. Susanna Nascimento's face hardened into a mask of pure rage. She looked directly at Pierluigi through the camera. You told me this aesthetic was entirely your own IP, legally separated from Gerd Decker's firm. You told me the funding was from a silent angel investor. Suzanne, please, I can explain, Pierluigi stammered, half standing from his chair. Save it for the authorities, Suzanne snapped. If you think I am tying my multi-billion-dollar waterfront development to stolen intellectual property and embezzled funds, you are out of your mind. We have no deal, Augur. Do not ever contact me again. The screen went black as she severed the connection. The silence that rushed into the room was absolute. Slawomir Geringer slowly closed the dossier. He carefully pushed his chair back and stood up. He didn't look at Pierluigi or Ludmila. He looked at Maigret. Ms. Jackson, it appears my clients have severely misrepresented the facts of this case to me. I am formally withdrawing as their legal counsel, effective immediately. Slawomir, you can't! Ludmila shrieked, the veneer of the victim completely shattered. The lawyer ignored her, packing his briefcase with practiced speed. He offered Soledad a brief, grim nod of respect before walking out of the glass room without looking back. Maigret turned her predatory gaze to the end of the table. Mr. Haruba, Campbell Haruba jumped in his seat, sweating profusely. Yes, Ms. Jackson. You have 1 hour to publish a full retraction of the defamatory article written about my client, Maigret dictated, tapping a manicured nail on the table. You will issue a formal apology, and you will publish the undeniable proof of Mr. Augur's embezzlement and intellectual property theft. If you fail to do so, I will own your publication by Friday. It will be up in 30 minutes, Campbell stammered, practically running for the door. Only Pierluigi, Ludmila, Soledad, Philippe, and Maigret remained. Pierluigi looked at Soledad, his eyes hollow, the arrogant charm completely stripped away. He looked exactly like what he was, a thief who had been caught. Sol, please, the police, they'll ruin me. You ruined yourself, Pierluigi, Soledad said softly, standing up. She looked at Ludmila, who was staring blankly at the mahogany table, her PR empire turning to ash around her. You thought I was clueless. You thought I was sweet and naive and easily discarded. You were wrong. Soledad turned and walked toward the heavy glass door. Philippe opened it for her, his hand resting briefly, warmly, against the small of her back as she stepped out of the room, leaving the architects of her former misery to face the wreckage of their own making. By 8 p.m., the adrenaline that had sustained Soledad for a week finally evaporated, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The firm was empty. The news of Pierluigi's impending arrest and the devastating retraction by Architectural Digest had ripped through the industry like a shockwave. Soledad's name had been cleared, elevated even. She was no longer the scorned woman. She was the brilliant, ruthless architect who had saved a $200 million project from ruin. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in her new corner office, looking out at the glittering skyline of the city. The glass felt cool against her forehead. She had won. She had everything she had fought for. But the silence of the office felt heavy. The wound of the betrayal was still there, a phantom ache in her chest. You should be celebrating, not brooding in the dark. Soledad turned. Philippe was standing in the doorway, his tie loosened, a bottle of very expensive vintage champagne and 2 crystal flutes in his hands. He looked as exhausted as she felt, but there was a soft, glowing warmth in his gray eyes as he looked at her. "I think I forgot how to celebrate," Soledad admitted, managing a weak smile. She moved away from the window and sank onto the plush leather sofa. Philippe walked in, popped the cork with a muted sigh, and poured the golden liquid. He handed her a glass and sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "To the architect of her own fate," Philippe toasted softly, clinking his glass against hers. Soledad took a sip. It tasted like starlight and victory. "Thank you, Philippe, for everything. You didn't have to stay and help me rebuild the structural models. You could have just filed your report and walked away." Philippe turned his head to look at her, his expression suddenly intensely serious. "I did not want to walk away." He set his glass down on the coffee table. "Gerd offered me a permanent position today, head of global engineering." Soledad's heart did a sudden chaotic flutter. "Did you accept?" "I told him I had a thriving consultancy in Paris. I told him I value my independence," Philippe murmured, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before meeting her eyes again. "But then I realized that the architecture in this specific office is captivating." Soledad's breath hitched. The tension that had been simmering between them over late-night calculations and shared cups of terrible coffee suddenly flared into a tangible electric heat. "Philippe, you are extraordinary, Soledad," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. He reached out, his long fingers gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. The touch sent a shiver racing down her spine. "I have never met a woman with such a brilliant mind and such a terrifying, magnificent spirit. Watching you dismantle them today, it was breathtaking." Soledad looked into his silver-flecked eyes and saw no pity, no condescension, and no deceit. She saw a man who recognized her entirely, her intellect, her strength, her flaws, and desired her fiercely for all of it. The ghost of Pierluigi, the sting of Ludmila's words, the week of corporate warfare, it all fell away, leaving only the charged space between them. Soledad set her glass down next to his. She didn't hesitate. She closed the distance between them, bringing her hands up to cup his face, and kissed him. Philippe responded instantly, a groan vibrating in his chest as his arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against him. The kiss was not tentative. It was a collision of relief, mutual respect, and undeniable pent-up passion. It tasted like champagne and the promise of a future she had built with her own two hands. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Philippe rested his forehead against hers, a genuine, dazzling smile breaking across his handsome face. "So," he whispered, his thumb stroking her cheekbone, "does the lead architect have room in her schedule for dinner with her head engineer tomorrow?" Soledad laughed, a bright, clear sound that chased the last of the shadows from the room. "I think I can pencil you in." 6 months later, the sky above the construction site was a brilliant, cloudless azure. The air smelled of turned earth, diesel, and possibility. Soledad Lima stood on the raised wooden podium, wearing a tailored white suit and a bright yellow hard hat. Before her lay the massive excavated footprint of the Horizon project. The steel foundation beams were already rising from the ground, the complex, flawlessly engineered skeleton of her design taking physical form. A crowd of hundreds, investors, city officials, journalists, and the entire staff of the firm were gathered for the groundbreaking ceremony. At the microphone, Bertil McCormick, the billionaire developer, was wrapping up his speech. "And so, we owe this revolutionary leap in sustainable urban living to the unwavering vision and unparalleled brilliance of our lead architect. Ladies and gentlemen, Soledad Lima." The applause was thunderous. Soledad stepped up to the microphone, her heart swelling with a profound sense of pride. She looked out at the crowd. She saw Gerd Decker nodding his fierce approval. She saw René Luna, her newly promoted senior designer, beaming with pride. And in the front row, standing tall and impossibly handsome in his navy suit, was Philippe. He caught her eye and offered a slow, secret smile that made her pulse race just as fast as it had on the night they first kissed in her office. She thought briefly of Pierluigi, who was currently awaiting trial for corporate fraud, his reputation annihilated. She thought of Ludmila, whose PR firm had dropped her, rendering her an outcast in the industry. The memory didn't hurt anymore. It was just a stepping stone on the path to where she stood now. "Thank you," Soledad said into the microphone, her voice ringing out clear and strong over the construction site. They say that architecture is the art of how to waste space, but I believe it is the art of truth. A building cannot lie. If the foundation is rotten, it will fall. But if the structure is built on integrity, on honesty, and on genuine vision, it will stand against any storm. She looked directly at Philippe, her smile radiant. Today, we are building something that will last. Thank you. As the crowd erupted into cheers once more, Soledad grabbed the ceremonial silver shovel. She drove it into the earth, turning the soil, officially breaking ground on her masterpiece. She had survived the shattering of her glass house, and from the shards she had built an empire. Soledad's journey proves that the darkest betrayals can sometimes serve as the exact catalyst we need to discover our true power. When her best friend forgot to hang up that phone, it didn't just end a relationship, it shattered an illusion. It forced Soledad to stop playing the supportive background character in someone else's life and step into the brilliant, formidable lead role of her own. She didn't just survive the storm of deceit, corporate espionage, and heartbreak. She engineered her own triumph, found a partner who truly matched her intellect and spirit in Philippe, and built a legacy that would touch the sky. Thank you so much for listening to this incredible story of revenge, resilience, and romance. If Soledad's triumph inspired you, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a great comeback story, and subscribe to the channel for more dramatic, emotional tales every single week.